That day, the entire Sheldonian theater at Oxford seemed to hold its breath, not because something tragic had happened, not because of a grand ceremony or a world-shaking event, but simply because of one sentence. One sentence spoken by a silver-haired man, a professor held in high regard with dozens of books and nearly 5 decades of teaching behind him. He said, "Africa has contributed nothing to human civilization." And just like that, the air seemed to vanish from the room. No whispers, no shuffling papers, not even a cough, just silence. Until one man stood up calmly, deliberately. He wasn't a student. He wasn't an activist. He was a black president, wearing a plain dark suit, still holding his notebook. And he simply said, "If I may, I'd like to respond." In less than 10 minutes, he would unravel an entire belief system, one that generations had accepted as unshakable truth. In the next few minutes, you'll uncover a treasure trove of African history that Western textbooks have never taught you. Remarkable discoveries in mathematics, law, philosophy, and science from a continent that's been labeled primitive for centuries, but in reality, helped build the foundation of human knowledge. And most importantly, why have those contributions been buried in silence for so long? But before we begin, if you care about truth, especially the kind no one talks about, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I want to know you're here with me. If what you're about to hear shifts your perspective, type 1 in the comments. If you're not convinced yet, go ahead and type 0. You never know, your comment might be the reason someone else begins their journey to the truth. Now, let's go back to that moment inside the heart of Oxford and follow the quiet, powerful voice of Ibrahim Traore from carved marks on a 44,000-year-old bone to humanist ideas that are only now being rediscovered by the modern world. This wasn't just a debate. It was a reminder truth can be buried, but it never disappears. Most of us grew up learning the same thing math began in Greece. Pythagoras-Euclid geometry theorems, all tied to white marble columns and the glow of Western thought. But what about the marks carved into a piece of antelope bone found in southern Africa? In a quiet cave in what is now Swaziland, archaeologists discovered something unusual, a bone with 29 notches evenly spaced. It wasn't just a random tally, it was a lunar calendar. We call it the Lubombo bone, and it's over 44,000 years old. Not far from there, in present-day Congo, another bone was found, this one even more complex. The Ishango bone. It showed not just counting, but patterns of prime numbers, multiplication, division, etched by hands that lived nearly 20,000 years ago. Hands that never saw Greece, hands that belonged to Africans. No blackboards, no textbooks, just the sky, the moon, the rhythms of nature, and the need to understand. They calculated, they observed. They built a relationship with the universe through numbers. But no one told us that. No one told us that the earliest math in human history started there on that continent, from people whose names were never written in the books we were taught from. Because when you believe math began in Greece, you stop asking questions. But when you learn it began in Africa, everything changes. But if numbers and patterns were just the beginning, then let's go next, to a place once called the Harvard of the 12th century, a city where books were worth more than gold, where scholars walked through desert sands to share ideas, and where African knowledge wasn't just preserved, it was celebrated. A student once stood in front of a replica of that bone silent for minutes. He wasn't crying because he was emotional. He cried because for the first time he saw himself in history. Math didn't begin in lecture halls. It began in the soil, in the stars, in the struggle to survive and the brilliance to make sense of it all. And if that's true, what else might be hiding beneath the surface? Let's go next to a place once called the Harvard of the 12th century, a city where books were treasured like gold and African knowledge touched the sky, Timbuktu. If someone asked you what's the oldest university in the world, You might say Oxford, or maybe Cambridge, or Harvard. But what if I told you that in the 12th century, while much of Europe was still crawling out of the Dark Ages, there was a city deep in the Sahara Desert that held over 700,000 manuscripts, and a university that educated more than 25,000 students every year? Would you believe it? I'm talking about Timbuktu. The name probably sounds like something out of a fairy tale. Remote, mysterious, almost mythical. And sadly, that's all most of the world remembers it as a dot on a forgotten map instead of the brilliant light it once was. But here's the truth. Timbuktu was once the intellectual capital of West Africa's Islamic Golden Age, and the University of Sankore at the heart of the city was one of the most advanced centers of learning on Earth. People didn't just study religion there, they studied astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, philosophy, poetry, rhetoric. Everything painstakingly written by hand, passed down from scholar to scholar. Some spent their entire lives copying just 3 books, and that was considered the highest form of contribution to the community. The libraries of Timbuktu were so vast, so valuable, that at one point a single manuscript was worth more than gold. A family with 200 manuscripts was considered wealthier than one with 100 camels. And the most beautiful part, none of this was imported from Europe. It was homegrown, built by Africans, written in African languages, rooted in African ways of thinking. There was a scholar named Ahmad Baba who wrote more than 1,600 books on medicine, law, ethics, astronomy. He was exiled by Moroccan colonizers because he knew too much. Because a black man who knows his worth is often seen as a threat. In 2012, when extremists invaded Timbuktu and threatened to burn the city's manuscripts, hundreds of locals, farmers, fishermen, even children banded together. They smuggled the books out by boat, by camel, by hand. Not because they were scholars, but because they understood something deeper. Knowledge is heritage, and a people without memory is like a tree without roots. It's strange, isn't it? At Oxford, we study Plato and Aristotle, but rarely hear about Sankore or Ahmad Baba. We are taught that the light of civilization came from the north. But maybe it's time we looked south toward a land that once burned brighter than most could ever imagine. Because Timbuktu is not just a place, it's proof. Proof that Africa wasn't a student of civilization. It was once a teacher to the world. And if we forget that, it's because we've allowed someone else to write our story for us. If a city could protect 700,000 manuscripts while much of Europe was still illiterate, what else have we never been told? In the next part, we'll explore something even more surprising. They say law came from Rome. But what if I told you that some of the world's earliest democratic governments weren't born in Europe, but in Africa? Systems with councils, checks and balances, and structures for shared power, centuries before America ever wrote its constitution. You're going to want to hear this. When people talk about democracy, the first name that usually comes up is Athens, the birthplace of Western politics, where Greek citizens gathered in the square to vote, debate, and shape their city's future. Sounds familiar, but if you look a little closer, something doesn't quite add up. Because democracy in Athens was only for men, not women, not the poor, and definitely not for the enslaved. So was that really democracy? Now, if we look south toward Africa, there's another story. One that almost no one tells you in history class. Let's start with the Ashanti people of West Africa. Centuries ago, they had a political system with 3 clear branches: a king, a council of elders, and a general assembly of the villages. The king couldn't just do whatever he wanted. If he made decisions without the council's approval, he could be removed. Not in some distant revolution, but right then in his own lifetime. Sound familiar? It's like checks and balances long before the United States was born. In Uganda, the Buganda kingdom had a parliament that included clan representatives. They debated national issues and used consensus as their guide. There was even an oral legal system where trained legal experts memorized entire laws and passed them down for generations. Why weren't we taught this? Maybe because it wasn't written on paper. Or maybe because it came from a continent history decided to ignore. Here's something else. In many African traditions, the most respected voice in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one who listens the longest. The one who waits in silence. And when they speak, everyone listens because their words come with weight. Democracy in Africa wasn't a battle of debates. It was an art of reconciliation. Even today in Rwanda, a country that survived genocide, they've revived a system called Gakaka community courts, where everyday people resolve conflict through dialogue, forgiveness, and healing justice. They didn't wait for a perfect system from the outside. They returned to what had already worked for them before. One African scholar once said, "We didn't learn democracy from France or America. We simply remembered what our ancestors already knew." If democracy means having a voice, then African communities have been doing that for centuries, whether the world listened or not. And maybe real democracy isn't just about ballots. Maybe it's about who's allowed to be part of the story, who gets to sit in the circle when decisions are made. In many African villages, everyone has a place in that circle, rich or poor, man or woman, no one left out. So when we teach students that democracy began in Athens, what are we really teaching them? Are we shaping their minds or narrowing their imagination of who matters? Sometimes to build a fairer future, we have to look back at the democracies that bloomed in the places history worked hard to forget. And if these democratic systems once thrived in Africa, then maybe it's not so hard to believe that philosophy, ethics, and humanity also found their roots there long ago. In the next part, we'll journey into the timeless wisdom of Africa, where the idea "I am, because we are" wasn't just a phrase, but a way of life. Let's meet there. In the West, we're taught that being strong means being independent. That to succeed, you must rise above the crowd, stand on your own, compete, win. You know the lines. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Be a self-made man. Look out for number one. But in many African cultures, there's a different kind of wisdom. It doesn't begin with the self. It begins with the community. It's called Ubuntu. The word comes from the Bantu languages of southern Africa, and though it has no perfect English translation, the idea is simple, yet profound. I am because we are. It means my well-being is tied to yours. That your pain is my concern. That what we build together matters more than what I build alone. Imagine growing up with that as your foundation. Imagine being taught that strength isn't measured by how far ahead you run, but by how many people you help keep up. This isn't just philosophy. It shaped real communities. It's how decisions were made, conflicts were resolved, lives were lived. In villages across southern and eastern Africa, Ubuntu was not written in constitutions, but practiced in kitchens, fire circles, and under mango trees. If someone made a mistake, they weren't cast out. They were brought to the center of the community. People gathered not to punish, but to remind them, "You are one of us. And when you hurt us, you also hurt yourself." Justice wasn't about vengeance. It was about restoration, about healing. Archbishop Desmond Tutu once said, "Ubuntu is the essence of being human. We say a person is a person through other people." He lived by it. He preached it. And when South Africa began its painful journey after apartheid, Ubuntu became the backbone of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. While many expected trials, revenge, even executions, South Africa chose something the world didn't expect: truth. Forgiveness. Rebuilding together. The world watched in disbelief, but to those raised on Ubuntu, it wasn't radical. It was familiar. It was ancient. It was home. And yet somehow, it's still dismissed. In a world that glorifies individualism, Ubuntu is often seen as soft, too idealistic, naive. But what's naive, really? Believing that everyone for themselves will lead to peace, or believing that no one truly wins unless we all rise. Imagine if Western societies embraced Ubuntu in schools, in courts, in neighborhoods. How would justice look? How would politics sound? And what kind of leaders would we create? If we raised children not to dominate, but to connect. See, Ubuntu doesn't erase individuality. It uplifts it within the context of community. It says, you matter. But so does the person next to you, and the one behind you, and the one you've never met but whose life touches yours in ways you don't yet see. There's a reason Ubuntu isn't widely taught in Western classrooms, because it challenges the core story. The story that greatness comes from standing alone, from being the exception. Ubuntu whispers something different, that maybe greatness isn't about being the best. Maybe it's about making everyone better, and that changes everything. Now, if African thought systems could offer such a profound moral compass long before modern psychology or human rights doctrines, what else might we have overlooked? In the next part, we'll uncover the medical and scientific breakthroughs that were pioneered in Africa, long before they showed up in European textbooks. Surgeries, vaccines, engineering, things that saved lives but whose origins were buried for centuries. Get ready, because what comes next will rewrite everything you thought you knew about who invents, who heals, and who truly leads the way. For centuries, the world marveled at scientific progress, medicine, metallurgy, architecture, innovation. But few ever wondered, where did that knowledge begin? Who first dared to cut into the body to save a life? Who built with such precision that modern engineers still scratch their heads in awe? The answer, more often than not, leads back to Africa. But here's the twist. When Africans practiced medicine, they weren't called doctors. They were called witches. When they built structures that defied logic, they weren't called engineers. They were called primitive. Truth is, for many African societies, healing was never just physical. It was spiritual, communal, intuitive. But that didn't mean it lacked science. Let's go back to Mali in the 14th century. Their surgeons were performing cataract removal with iron instruments centuries before the same procedure appeared in European hospitals. Or Uganda in 1879, where doctors performed cesarean sections in rural clinics. Both mother and child survived. European doctors at the time thought it was impossible. The techniques used antiseptics made from banana alcohol, sterilized tools, hand washing, long before modern germ theory caught on. But when colonial explorers saw these things, they didn't write home about the brilliance. They wrote about strange rituals. They didn't understand what they saw, so they dismissed it. Even vaccinations long before Jenner's cowpox method were practiced in West Africa. Enslaved Africans brought the technique of smallpox variolation to the Americas, quietly saving lives during outbreaks in Boston. Did anyone thank them? No. Their knowledge was borrowed, repackaged, and renamed. Then there's architecture. The Great Zimbabwe Complex, with its massive stone walls built without mortar, still standing after 700 years. Its design includes acoustic principles that rival modern amphitheaters. Or the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, Ethiopia, carved from single pieces of volcanic stone with angles and drainage systems that still function today. When Europeans first saw the Benin bronzes, they were so sophisticated people couldn't believe they were made by Africans. So instead, they created a lie that Portuguese travelers must have done it. Why? Because it's easier to invent myths than to admit you've ignored genius. It's not just about bias, it's about control. If you deny where knowledge comes from, you control who gets credit and who gets erased. One story that always stays with me: in a small village in Ghana, a local healer had a 90% success rate treating malaria using herbs. When a Western doctor visited, he dismissed it as superstition. But later, that very same plant, Artemisia, was patented by a European pharmaceutical company. The healer never saw a cent, not even a mention. This is the pattern. Knowledge is extracted, stripped of context, and the source is left in silence. But the truth has a way of resurfacing. Today, African herbal medicine is being studied by global biotech firms. Engineers are revisiting ancient irrigation systems in the Sahel to adapt them for climate resilience. Slowly, the world is remembering, and maybe that's the lesson here. Wisdom doesn't always come in lab coats. Innovation doesn't always wear a name tag. And brilliance isn't limited by geography or skin color or accent. It lives in observation, in memory, in the hands of those who dared to heal long before they were ever believed. So the next time you walk into a modern hospital or marvel at a feat of architecture, ask yourself who gets remembered and who was forgotten. In the next part, we'll take that question even deeper as we explore the role of African astronomy and mathematics. Because while Europe was still arguing about whether the Earth was flat, African scientists were already mapping the stars, calculating orbits, and building calendars that still astonish researchers today. Let's look to the sky together. Look up. That's what we've always done as humans, as dreamers, as scientists. We look to the stars and wonder, where are we? What's out there? How do we fit into this vast moving sky? We're told that astronomy began with Galileo, that Copernicus discovered the heliocentric model, that Western minds were the first to map the heavens. But the truth, Africa had been watching the stars long before Europe even looked up. In Mali, centuries ago, the Dogon people knew things that baffled modern astronomers. They spoke of a star Sirius B, a white dwarf, invisible to the naked eye. They described its orbit, its density, and its companion star, all without telescopes. When French scientists studied them in the 20th century, they were stunned. How could an isolated community in West Africa know so much about a star only recently detected by advanced equipment? The Dogon simply said, "We've always known. Our ancestors told us." And this isn't an isolated story. In Ethiopia, ancient calendars were based on solar-lunar cycles so precise they rival modern timekeeping. Some communities followed 13 months, with each month carefully aligned to phases of the moon, not just for marking time, but for planting, harvesting, healing. In Kenya, the Borana people used a complex star calendar to guide everything from migration to livestock care. They watched not just stars, but the spaces between them, tracking shifting patterns over generations. These weren't myths. They were data systems, passed down through storytelling, ritual, and memory. The sky was their laboratory, and the elders without white coats, without degrees, were their astronomers. And yet, when textbooks list the fathers of astronomy, the names are always European, as if intelligence needs a telescope to be real. It's a quiet erasure. A way of saying, if we didn't see you discover it, then you never did. But the stars don't belong to any one culture. They've always been above all of us, offering their light freely. It's how we choose to see them that changes everything. There's a story told in the Sahel region that when a child was born, an elder would point to a star and say, "That one will guide your path." It wasn't superstition. It was memory, a way of anchoring life to the cosmos, of saying, "You're not alone. The universe has a rhythm, and you are part of it." Modern science is just now beginning to catch up with what traditional African cosmologies have long understood, that everything is connected. That time is not just a straight line. That what we observe outside reflects something inside. Imagine if these voices had been part of our classrooms. Imagine if children learned astronomy not just from NASA, but from the elders who told stories under a baobab tree, who tracked constellations not with software, but with memory and reverence. We lost something when we dismissed these traditions. Not just knowledge, but a way of relating to the universe that was deeply human. And that's the thing, Africa didn't just look up. Africa listened. And in listening, they discovered truths long before the world was ready to believe them. In the next part, we'll explore one final frontier music. Because while we often talk about stars in the sky, there's another kind of star. The kind that moves people, shakes empires, and gave birth to the soundtrack of modern life. From call and response to jazz to blues to hip-hop, we'll follow the rhythm back to its roots. And what we find might just change the way you hear the world. When Traore finished speaking, there was a stillness in the Sheldonian theater, not the kind that comes from shock, but the kind that comes when something sacred has just happened. Then, a single clap. Then another. And within seconds, the entire room erupted, not just in applause, but in release. Students stood, professors stood. Even administrators who had been silent for years rose to their feet. Some clapped with pride, some with shame, and some with tears quietly rolling down their cheeks because they knew they had been part of the silence for too long. Then something even more unexpected. Professor Mary Whitfield, head of African Studies at Oxford, took the microphone. She didn't offer a counter-argument. She didn't defend the institution. She said, "Mr. President, on behalf of this university, I apologize." In that moment, Oxford, a place known for its centuries-old pride, did something rare. It listened. It acknowledged. And it changed. Within weeks, the university announced a full curriculum review. Departments began adding African texts. Guest lectures were planned. And 1 year later, a statue was unveiled in the main quadrangle, not of Traore himself, who had humbly declined, but of Ahmed Baba of Timbuktu, the scholar whose works had once been erased, now standing at the center of one of the world's oldest institutions. But amid this wave of celebration, there was another feeling too. Why did it take so long? Why did it require a head of state, a viral speech, and global pressure for people to finally say, "You're right"? The truth is, most institutions don't change because they see the light. They change because someone shines that light directly into their eyes and refuses to let them look away. It's not that they didn't know. It's that they were comfortable not knowing, because knowing requires action. And action risks everything. A young African-American professor once shared his story after the Traore speech went viral. He taught African philosophy at a mid-sized university in the U.S. One semester, he added a unit on Timbuktu manuscripts complete with readings on astronomy, medicine, ethics, and law. After class, a senior faculty member stopped by his office. Smiling, but with a hint of mockery, he said, "Come on. You're not seriously telling them Africa had universities, are you?" The professor didn't argue. He just handed him a copy of a 12th century manuscript, painstakingly translated from Arabic. The older man flipped through the pages, then muttered, "Never seen this before." Then he walked out. No apology, no reflection, just silence. That's how it often works. The silence doesn't always come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from habit. From people too used to being the only ones holding the pen. So when Traore spoke, he didn't just dismantle a lie. He dismantled the comfort that let the lie survive. And in doing so, he reminded the world that knowledge, real knowledge, doesn't hide in ivory towers. It waits in silence until someone brave enough dares to say, "We were here. We knew. We mattered." But even then, not everyone claps. Not everyone listens. Because for some, truth is not a light, it's a mirror. In the final part of this story, we'll look directly into that mirror. We'll talk about power erasure and the fight for truth. A fight not against people, but against the comfort of forgetting. Because this isn't just a story about Africa. It's a story about all of us and what kind of world we're brave enough to remember. History isn't just facts, it's choices. Choices about what to remember and what to leave out. We've been told that civilization started in the north, that the south only followed, that greatness came from white marble and European minds. But now we know that's only half the story. The truth is, African civilizations didn't just exist. They flourished. They taught. They healed. They built, discovered, and imagined long before they were ever discovered by someone else. The tragedy isn't that Africa was behind. The tragedy is that Africa was so far ahead it had to be hidden, because its greatness was too inconvenient for those who came to conquer. When colonizers arrived, they brought weapons, but also textbooks. Textbooks designed to erase what they couldn't explain and to rewrite what they couldn't steal. They didn't want the world to know that the people they enslaved were descendants of scholars, scientists, architects, and philosophers, so they told a different story. One that made exploitation seem like salvation. One that made ignorance look like enlightenment. And for centuries, we believed it. But truth has a long memory. It waits in buried bones, in forgotten manuscripts, in melodies passed from village drums to jazz clubs in Harlem. And every time someone dares to tell it, another lie begins to crumble. So let this be the beginning of something bigger. Let this be the moment we stop asking if Africa contributed to civilization and start asking why we were never told it did. Because the truth doesn't belong to one color, one flag, or one empire. It belongs to everyone. But if we stay silent, the lie wins. This isn't just about setting the record straight. It's about reclaiming what was stolen, not gold, but dignity. Not artifacts, but stories. Not power, but presence. And if you're hearing all this and thinking, this changes everything, you're not alone. Because the greatest act of resistance isn't rage, it's remembrance. And the greatest gift we can give future generations is a history that sees them fully, truthfully, unapologetically. So if this message resonated with you, you know what to do. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the bell. Not because it's a trend, but because it's a movement. A movement toward truth, toward wholeness, toward a history that belongs to all of us. And I want to hear from you. If something in this video made you think differently, made you pause, made you feel, drop a 1 in the comments. If you're still unsure if this feels uncomfortable, you can leave a 0 too. Because even silence has something to teach us. And most of all, share this video. Not to destroy anyone, not to win arguments, but to restore what has been buried. Because truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs us to stop whispering. This is not the end. It's just the first chapter in a history we write together. And if you're here reading these words, listening with an open heart, then maybe, just maybe, the future has a fighting chance.